So how does this happen? How does a country go from peaceful protests in the street to an all-out war? That's what we're going to unpack here. We're going to trace the key moments that lit the fuse for the war in Ukraine, a conflict that has, completely redrawn the security map of Europe. Okay, to really get what's happening today, you gotta go back. We need to rewind the clock to 2014 to find that one political spark that set everything off. It's really a story about a country caught between two huge powers, a story that all kicks off with one massive decision.
Right. So, here we are, a nation at a crossroads, and it all boils down to this one huge question that would literally split the country. Do we look west, towards Europe, or do we stay in Russia's shadow?
And just look how fast everything went downhill. It started with these pro-EU protests, what we now call the Euromaidan, but that quickly morphed into this massive national uprising. We're talking about just a few short, violent months, and the whole situation in Kyiv Central Square just exploded. It was like a pressure cooker. The president ends up fleeing the country, and just like that, Ukraine's future is on a totally different track.
So this is what it all came down to. On one hand, you've got the EU. They're offering a path to join them, but it comes with homework. Major reforms. On the other hand, Russia comes in with this giant pile of cash, $15 billion in loans, cheaper gas, and basically no questions asked. Well, President Yanukovych chose the Russian deal. And that one decision, that was the match that lit the whole fire.
Okay, so Kiev is in total chaos, right? A new pro-Western government is coming in, and Moscow is watching its influence just evaporate. Russia's reaction was, well, it was fast. And it was military. The very first move was to go after the Crimean Peninsula, which is, a hugely strategic piece of land.
And this is where we see the start of something new, what people call hybrid warfare. All of a sudden, these mysterious soldiers, the little green men, just appear all over Crimea. We're talking professional troops, but with no flags, no insignia. They took over airports, military bases, government buildings with this incredible speed and precision. The rest of the world, including Ukraine, was just left scratching their heads, trying to figure out what on earth was going on.
So with Crimea basically under military occupation, they hold this super quick referendum. The Kremlin, of course, says it's a landslide vote to join Russia. But pretty much everyone else, Ukraine, most of the international community, called it a sham, totally illegitimate. But for Russia, that was enough. It was all the cover they needed to go ahead and officially annex the peninsula.
But if you thought it was all about Crimea, you'd be wrong. That was just the opening act. The fire immediately jumped to eastern Ukraine, to the industrial heartland known as the Donbas. And there, Russian-backed militants, armed by Moscow, funded by Moscow, start taking over cities and towns. They declare these so-called republics, and boom, you have a full-blown brutal war that's just going to grind on and on for years.
So after all that chaos, things started to settle, but not in a good way. It settled into this long, ugly stalemate. For 8 years, this war in the East turned into what everyone called a frozen conflict. Frozen, maybe, but people were still dying every single day.
All right, so as the body count kept climbing, the international community started pushing hard for some kind of diplomatic solution. And that's where the Minsk agreements came in. This was supposed to be the big plan, a complex roadmap to stop the fighting and figure out a political future for the Donbass.
The thing is, the Minsk agreements, they were a mess. They were built on really shaky ground. Big parts of the deal were just never put into practice. And the ceasefire? It was a joke. It was broken all the time. So instead of peace, you get this frozen conflict. And for 8 long years, the Donbass was just this grim world of trench warfare and shelling. It became this forgotten war, where soldiers were dying every day, while most of the world just wasn't paying attention.
Yeah, but frozen doesn't mean stable. Not at all. And by late 2021, you could see the ice starting to crack. All those tensions that have been simmering for years finally hit a boiling point. And that set the stage for something much, much worse.
So here we go. It's December 2021. Russia has more than 100,000 troops parked on Ukraine's border. And then they lay their cards on the table. They issue this list of demands, basically ultimatums, to the US and NATO. The big ones? A legally binding promise that Ukraine will never join NATO, and a rollback of NATO forces in Eastern Europe. They framed it as, an existential threat to their security.
And the West's answer? It was a hard no. I mean, you can't really overstate this. It was a fundamental clash of how they see the world. For Russia, it's all about having a sphere of influence. For the West, it's about every country having the right to choose its own path. Diplomacy hit a brick wall. And at that point, the path to war looked pretty much inevitable.
And then it happened. In the early morning of February 24, 2022, President Putin gets on TV and announces a special military operation. He gives this justification about needing to protect people from genocide and wanting to, quote, demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. And with that, the full-scale invasion began from the land, the air, and the sea.
And that invasion kicked off the biggest, most brutal war Europe has seen in generations. The fallout from this has been absolutely staggering, and honestly, its effects have reached every single corner of the globe.
So let's just talk about the sheer scale of this thing. Even after years of incredible Ukrainian resistance, Russia still holds about a fifth of the country. To give you an idea of what that means, that's a chunk of land bigger than Austria and Switzerland combined. Just think about that.
The human toll is it's hard to even wrap your head around. We're talking about an estimated 56,000 civilian casualties just since the big invasion started. And that number, it just keeps going up every single day, with missile and drone attacks hitting cities nowhere near the actual fighting.
And it's not just the casualties. This war has triggered the biggest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. Almost 6 million Ukrainians are now refugees around the world. I mean, 6 million people who had to just drop everything and run for their lives.
Now, the international response has been absolutely massive. I mean, historic. Check out this number. Almost $385 billion in aid just from the US and the EU since 2022. It's like an unprecedented fire hose of money, humanitarian aid, and of course weapons, all to help Ukraine stay in the fight.
So, after all this time, after all the brutal fighting, it almost feels like we've come full circle. The war has bogged down again into this grinding war of attrition. It's an absolute meat grinder of artillery, drones, and bloody attacks, where every single foot of ground costs an enormous number of lives.
And all of this leaves us, not just Ukraine, but all of us, with this really tough, unsettling question. In a war like this, where a clean knockout punch just doesn't seem possible, what does winning even mean anymore? And how do you ever build a lasting peace? That's the strategic puzzle that is going to shape global security for a very, very long time.